Hi guys, welcome to this set of videos. What we're going to do in these videos is they're going to follow along with the notes where we're going to take a little bit closer look at this idea of congruence. In fact, hopefully what you can see here are title to this section, corresponding parts of congruent figures are congruent. It's going to be a major idea here in this section of the notes in these videos. Let's go ahead and take a look at our essential question to get us started. Here's what you guys are going to want to be able to answer by the time we get to the end of this set of notes, and it's simply this. What can you conclude? What can you determine about two figures that are congruent? Now, in order to help us do that, right, our objectives, the things that we need to know, are going to be these. You'll need to be able to make conclusions about segments and angles of congruent figures that are congruent, and we're going to use that to solve equations or find unknown values of congruent figures. So, let's jump right into this. All right. Really important definition. We're going to take a little bit of time here on this one. Let me highlight it for you and then say a couple of things about it. First, please notice that this definition of congruence is something we've seen before. Let me underline a couple of things for you. Here is hopefully what you see. If two figures are congruent, then corresponding sides are congruent and corresponding angles are congruent. You should recognize this from Chapter 1, Section 4 as what we call a conditional statement. Remember the way a conditional statement works? It was this. If P, then Q, right? If P, then Q. Look, if P, two figures are congruent. If two figures are congruent, that's if P. Then Q, then corresponding sides are congruent and corresponding angles are congruent. What we have here is a conditional statement that if the first part is true, then the second part must be true. And if then, conditional statement, if P is true, then Q must be true. Now, here's how that's going to work in these problems. Please notice in this first example problem, I have told you, I tell you right there, these two triangles are congruent. So what I'm telling you is the triangles are congruent. Now, remember the way a conditional statement works. If P, then Q. If P is true, then Q must be true. Here's what I've done. I've told you the triangles are congruent. That's P, right? The triangles are congruent. So what can you conclude? Well, if P is true, then Q must also be true. So you would say, then corresponding parts are congruent. Okay, again, I know that's going back there a ways, back to Chapter 1, Section 4, where we took a look at conditional statements, but that's exactly what we have here for a definition of congruence. If the first part is true, then the second part must be true. Conditional statement, if P, then Q. What I've done in this first example problem is I've told you P, the hypothesis, is true. These two triangles, these guys right here, they are congruent. Because the hypothesis is true, the conclusion must be true. If P, then Q. So, since the triangles are congruent, their corresponding parts must be congruent. Now, your job is to figure out what are the corresponding parts. So, let's take a look at it. I have triangle A, B, C. I have triangle D, E, F. I tell you those two triangles are congruent. Same shape, same size. How does that work? Well, hopefully, just by looking at it, you can see if I took this triangle, right, and I just flipped it over, I could lay these two triangles on top of each other, right? So if that's all you're doing, angle C corresponds, right? If I took this guy and flipped it over, just flip him over, angle C corresponds with which angle? I agree. Angle F. How do we show that? Well, just put one little... There we go. I now know those two angles must be congruent. How do I know? Triangles are congruent. That's the if P. The conclusion, corresponding parts must be congruent. Those are corresponding parts. They must be congruent. Let's keep going. I take this guy. I flip him over. So, angle B corresponds with which angle? I agree. Angle B corresponds with angle E. Make sure that you use the two little hashes, right? Because B and E are congruent. They're the same, but they're not the same as C and F, right? So that's why I have to use the two little arcs, right, to show these are congruent, but they're not congruent to C and F, right? Keep going. Angle A. Well, this one's easy. You only have one choice left. It's got to be D. So, three little arcs to show that A and D are my other corresponding angles. But it's not just angles. Corresponding angles are congruent. It's also corresponding sides are congruent. So let's go ahead and figure that out as well. If I took this guy, I flipped him over, right? This side right here, side AB, corresponds with which side in this triangle? Yeah, you're right. AB corresponds with side DE. Awesome. Great. In this triangle, side AC corresponds with which side in this triangle? Yeah, I think so. AC corresponds with DF. Again, two hash marks. Why? Well, one hash mark tells me that those sides are congruent. Two hash marks tells me that those two sides are congruent, but all of the sides are not congruent to each other, right? AC is not congruent to DE, right? Two hash marks, one hash mark, right? So the hash marks indicate which sides are congruent, but also tells you which sides are not congruent, right? And then the last one, BC, yeah, it's got to be EF. So three little hash marks. Now, the easy part, right? That's, believe it or not, that's the tricky part. Now we answer the questions. I want to know the length of the line segment DE. Well, where's DE? Right there, that's DE. Please notice, single hash mark. Go to the other triangle. Single hash mark. What's the length of this side? And since corresponding parts have to be congruent, guess what the length of this side has to be? Just that simple, 2.6 centimeters. I also ask you to find the measure of angle B. Measure angle B. We can do that. We can do that. We can do that. Here's the measure. There's B right there. There's B. I want to know what's the measure of that angle. Well, find its corresponding angle in the other triangle. B, 2 arcs. E, 2 arcs. What's the measure of E? 65 degrees. So what does B have to be? B has to be 65 degrees. Why? Well, the triangles are congruent, and if the triangles are congruent, corresponding angles are congruent, right? Since these are corresponding angles, they must also be congruent. Just that simple, guys. Let's try another one. Here you go. Two triangles. Let's go ahead. Let's find the corresponding parts, right? Why? Well, because I tell you right there, there's the if P. These triangles are congruent. They are congruent. If P, then Q. So what is the conclusion you can draw? If the triangles are congruent, then you know corresponding parts, angles and sides, must be congruent. So let's find them. All right. Let's start with T. Right here, angle T. Oh, sorry, that's my highlighter. Pen, there we go. What is the corresponding angle to angle T? I agree, it's W. Boom. Great. Corresponding angle to angle S. I agree, it's V. Two arcs. Two arcs. And that leaves us with our last one. So U. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Awesome, fantastic. Sides. Let's do the sides. Well, by far, there's my longest side. So I'm gonna put a single hash there, and by far, that's my longest side. So a single hash there. I know that these two sides, SU and VX, must be the same. How do I know that? I tell you the triangles are congruent. If I tell you the triangles are congruent, then you know corresponding sides must be congruent. That's how the conditional statement works. If they're congruent, then corresponding sides are congruent. So there we go. Boom, UT. Congruent. Congruent to what? I agree. WX. That leaves me with last one. Fantastic. That's the tricky part. That's the tough part. Now, the easy part. What is SU? Let's see. SU. Right there. There is the side, SU. That's the line segment, SU. Find its congruent side. Right there. VX. Oh, and look at that. I tell you how long it is. That means that SU must also be 43 feet in length. Boom. How about, measure of angle S. We can do that. We can do that. There's S right there. What is its corresponding angle? That one, V. Oh, and look at that. I give you the measure of V. So you now know the measure of S. Right, guys? Couldn't be easier, and it all depends on our new definition of congruence, right? And that new definition is a conditional statement. If two objects are congruent, then the corresponding angles and the corresponding sides must also be congruent. If I tell you they're congruent, find the corresponding angles, find the corresponding sides, you know they must be congruent. Now, what we're going to do, because you guys know I'm an algebra teacher. Algebra is what I do. I love algebra, and I told you every chance I get in geometry, we're going to do algebra. So, on the next page of the notes, we're going to do the exact same thing. Same thing, but we're going to introduce a variable, which is going to force you to set up equations that we will then solve. And check this out. Students will solve equations to find unknown values for congruent parts. There it is, our second objective for this set of notes. So I can't wait. Head on over to the next page of the notes. I'll meet you guys there.